Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Geeden, and I'm one of the co-owners and CEOs for Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools. And these tools are actually helping life science companies from across the globe over the past 12 years do everything from virtualize their advisory boards, medical meetings, investigator sessions, corporate events, and everything in between. But what we really believe is that these conversations not only should get started and leverage using these virtual platforms, but we can leverage and use these virtual sessions to also sustain the momentum of these conversations over the long term. So you can develop the ideas, build on them, help to amplify the meaning and the amplification of it over time. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with these really big thought leaders, digital provocateurs, leading edge thinkers, we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm really excited about having one of these big thought leaders, Cassie Solomon, at the table with me today. Cassie Solomon is an award-winning author. She's the founder of Shea Solutions, as well as the CEO of the New Group consulting company. She's also the co-founder of the Mid-Atlantic AI Alliance and a founding member of the Society for Healthcare Innovation. She has an MBA in Operations Management from the Wharton School, as well as a bachelor's degree in Organizational Behavior from Yale University. As an expert, Cassie has been an expert on leading successful change. She's helped senior leaders transform their organizations, companies such as little companies that we've all heard of, such as Twitter, Pandora, Bayer Pharmaceuticals, Penn Medicine, Geisinger Health System, and many more. She thrives on helping leaders in complex matrix environments, and she teaches executives at the Wharton School of Business. She has a book that she's written. It's called Leading Successful Change, 8 Keys to Making Change Work. She also, which was also co-authored with Greg Shea, and helps leaders successfully navigate the ever-increasing pace of change. Welcome, Cassie. So happy to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Natalie. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, we are celebrating the International Women's Day. And so very excited about having you on our show today. You've obviously had a very interesting and very enlightened career trajectory. And I think for other women who might be listening to the show, we'd love if you could share with us what you've actually done and how you came about founding some of these companies, being an author, and landing in the place that you are today.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a great first question. I went to a consulting firm out of Wharton that was here in Philadelphia, which is where I still am headquartered, and worked there for 16 years, a little bit of time off for good maternal behavior. I'll mention that because we're doing International Women's Day today. And went out on my own in 2007, just as the economy was beginning to tank. So that was a bold move at that time. My daughter bought me a necklace that says Fearless, which is kind of associated with that move at that moment. And most of what we did at the firm and most of what I did when I went out on my own was organizational change. Lots of work in healthcare provider organizations. I've been in-house at Christiana Care in Delaware as a consultant on retainer for years, and also at Penn Medicine, which I love because it really gave me an opportunity to see what these legacy health systems are like from the inside. But in the last couple of years, I really have become, I called it my sort of working sabbatical, really preoccupied with studying technology and how disruptive technology is going to influence change in work and specifically in healthcare and the delivery of clinical care. And out of that work grew much more strategy work. I do almost exclusively strategy work now for clients. I think of them as very tightly connected. If you are doing organizational change, you want to have a powerful strategy behind it. If you don't, it's not going to be very successful. And if you're doing strategy, you really want to be someone who can be an architect of that change and understand what's going to go along with that strategy.
And you obviously have written a very, very successful book, and called the leading successful change, 8 keys to making change work. And what's really interesting about this, because we always hear about the word strategy, 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 and sometimes this can be very high level, very unattainable. It's very aspirational. But you've written a book so that you've brought it down to a place where it can be actionable. You've almost created like a workbook. So we're going to want to tease through these 8 concepts that I think are really going to help people who are listening today think and really kind of, we can all apply this to anybody who's an entrepreneur or somebody who's working as an intrapreneur within a large organization. We can all relate to some of these. So first of all, let's break this down when we talk about the kinds of organizations that you work with. And when you speak to leaders about their organization, tell us a little bit about how you talk to them about really breaking down the structure of what they've created. And obviously, structure at a big pharma company is going to be different than a small biotech, which is going to be different from a digital therapeutic startup. Tell us a little bit around what you speak to them about when you're talking about the structure and the org chart and the way various groups are working together in the organization.
So I think that we should start by talking a little more about the book, Natalie, because that really is foundational to the method I use when I'm working with organizations. It's Greg Shea's work systems model, which he's been teaching at Wharton for decades. And I just fell in love with it. As a practitioner, I needed a really workable model, as you said, that translates easily on the ground. And I just started using it in my work. Greg and I, interestingly enough, have known each other since I was 18 years old, because he was a grad student at Yale when I was an undergrad in the same department. And 20 years later is when I fell in love with his theory. And so, he said, "You're the person that should write the book with me." It's a systems approach to change, which makes it very complementary to some of the change management techniques that people are probably familiar with, like ProSci or John Kotter. Basically, we begin by saying, what is your vision for the future? What do you want to see? What's the scene? And you can use that to ask the question about strategy, or you can use that to ask the question about changing a workflow or a team. That vision piece really comes first. But the second important part of it is thinking about these 8 levers of change. I love to call it the 8 levers of change, because a system can be broken down into these 8 different elements. People is one, rewards is one, how your meeting cycle works is one, information distribution, which is a really important one as we think about digitizing work right now.
And anyway, I'm gonna want to get into each one of them. So that's why I was starting with the organizational structure. But absolutely, I'd like to linger on some of those as well.
I think one of the key messages of the book and the model, and this is a reason that I see a lot of change initiatives not being successful, is people think they can just change one aspect of the system, and often they start with their people and they say, "Oh, let's bring in some training here, or let's have a big initiative with a big kickoff," and that's the only thing they change. We say you have to change at least 4 out of 8 elements of the system in order for a change to be successful. And the more the merrier. 8 out of 8, a much more powerful change.
That is really, really awesome. And I love the fact that it really comes from what you're calling a systems innovation thinking model, where there's multiple components to a complex system. It goes beyond complicated, it's called complex. And there's so many different kinds of components. And so you're looking at this holistically and looking at, you're mentioning these various levers at which to pull so that there's, this incremental change can suddenly have an explosive view. It's sort of like the iceberg model, where you're working behind the scenes and then and then it sort of bubbles to the top, and then you see the systematic change that happens. So coming back to the question of, one of the first levers that you refer to in the book is around organization. Right. So what are some of the things that you do talk to leaders about when you're getting them to reflect on the organizational structure, how they're thinking about things? Because at the end of the day, when we talk about innovations thinking, we realize that fundamentally it's about people, and it's really around incentivization models, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But it's really about people and how you're organizing them and how they're grouped together to work on projects and to work as committee members. And and working as task forces. So tell us a little bit around that particular lever.
So I had a conversation with a CEO that I coached a number of years ago, and he said, I'm really unhappy. My people are, behaving in silos, and they're really hanging on to their own turf, and they have all this conflict between them. How can I reorganize this so that they behave differently and they're, more together as a senior team? And I said, Bob, you came into this organization and gave organizations are built to be effective silos. You house all the people that are in finance in the same department. You give everyone a separate P&L. You reward them for their individual division performance, and they all have the same background. So they're sitting together, they're talking to each other, they understand each other's language, they have the same incentives. Of course, they're going to behave like a silo. I said, let's go crazy for a minute. What if you incentivized the group for group performance instead of departmental or division performance? And I think that a lot of times companies are frustrated by the way their groups are working together, and they will go through a restructure. They'll say, we're going to be a matrix organization now. We're going to go geographic plus function. And if that's the only lever that they're changing, they'll be frustrated. People will continue to behave the way they did before. They won't get to the result that they want. So it really comes down to saying, let's envision what it is you're trying to accomplish. How do you want people to behave differently? How do you want them to interact? And then let's look at organization, and let's look at the other levers and orchestrate a change so that, in a sense, the right way of behaving becomes the easiest thing to do and the easiest way to behave.
We've all been hit dramatically with norms and protocols since COVID-19. And we're now celebrating the 1-year anniversary, unfortunately, when there was the official lockdown. And this has impacted the way workplaces are thinking and doing, and systems, and the way people are doing things. So I'm actually just curious, Cassie, is prior to COVID and then after COVID, has your coaching on the organizational structure, and even more importantly, workplace design? Because again, at one point, all of us were going to offices. We were commuting, heading into these big downtown cores. There was physical spaces, the way meeting rooms were booked, and the way technology was being used in the office, and various work tools. What did that look like, and what was your coaching before COVID? And has it changed since we've all started working remotely?
So I just want to start by saying it's an extremely creative time, Natalie, and that came as a surprise to me. I think there are a couple of silver linings in this COVID mess. And one of them is that people are really open to thinking differently about how they work. And so it's a very open time to think about strategy differently, and people are much more open to organizational change than they were, partly because all of us have demonstrated how dramatically we can change. And it's an amazing case study. I'll just do virtual work because that's what Impetus supports. You talked about the workplace design lever. That's two things. That's the technology or the tool, and it's also where the work is done. So when we think about COVID, we say, well, we had Zoom technology. If I had $1 for every time somebody said, gosh, I'm glad this didn't happen 10 years ago, we would not have been able to adapt to the change in the way that we did. But it also changed workflow. We all had to be trained to use the new technology effectively. We had to learn how to do conferences online. The rewards lever is a really interesting one to think about. Rewards lever refers to both positive things and also negative consequences. Suddenly there was an enormous negative consequence for us to go into the office, so we stopped overnight, right? Didn't need to be, persuaded. It was really plain. So when all 8 of the levers are pulled as hard as possible, we have a little diagram that shows, is this a 1 on a scale of strength, or is this a 7? I think COVID gave us an example of how fast people can adapt when all the levers go to 7 at the same time.
I love the fact that you found the silver lining in this, because certainly this period has been exorbitantly stressful for many people, not only who are the unit contributors, but certainly the leadership. in really looking very rapidly at how to try to maintain culture, communication, conversation, and work productivity in a period where people were worried about their jobs and what was happening, and just an incredible amount of impact on people's mental health and wellness. And so I love the fact that you use the word creative opportunity, because I think that's a really great silver lining viewpoint on all of it. So with all of that said, is what sorts of strategy are you planning or working with leaders today on the effective implementation of technologies and platforms? Has that become a much larger part of your strategic conversations with people that you do work with today?
So I think that I got into strategy because I was really frustrated by the kinds of strategic planning that I saw my clients doing, and they were also frustrated. I think that the time of the static strategic plan is over. Um, I'm going to figure out what I'm going to be doing for the next 3 to 5 years. I'm going to push that out to my organization, and then we're going to go do it. That's that's not realistic anymore. So I drew on the futures training that I did and work that I've done in organizational change, and said we have to start with scenario planning. I want my clients to be imagining different futures at the beginning of the process, at least, so that we can then step back and say, okay, all of these are plausible futures for this organization. Do we see any common threads across the scenarios that we just built? Anything that my mentor would call robust. These things, if no matter what happens in the environment around us, we can feel confident. And there are a number of those kinds of robust themes, as you can imagine, as we think about the digital transformation that most companies are grappling with. But if you can't imagine different possible futures, I think you're not becoming a resilient team that can deal with change.
Yeah, absolutely. And the word resilience has come up in so many different times in the last little while. Is like, how resilient are we? And we've heard a lot about these, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, especially around clinical trials, and this whole idea around decentralizing them and making sure that clinical trial endpoints are more resilient, and that clinical trials can continue and patients can start reporting their outcomes, et cetera. Are these the kinds of conversations that you're having with any of the commercial or medical teams as it relates to how they were doing work and how they're doing work now? Is the word resiliency coming up even within their work frames?
Yes, and I think that's actually why they're attracted to this kind of strategic planning, because people kind of understand right now that the world is very dynamic and the external environment is very dynamic, and they don't want to end up with a single plan. I also say to them, and I believe this, that doing the work of planning should make your team more resilient. If you think together about what's possible, we also do something that the Army calls red teaming, which sounds alarming, but is really fun, actually, where we say, imagine that it's 5 or 10 years from now, and your competitors have taken you out, or you've been disrupted, or the business has failed. Come back, really live into that possibility, and then come back and talk, as a team about what happened. And the most important question to answer is, what did we do wrong? How did we enable that collapse scenario to take place? And those conversations are very interesting and very powerful. People really don't have a hard time with that assignment. They know enough about their own vulnerabilities and the weaknesses of the business to be able to have really good conversations about that. And then you go on to say, okay, put aside the red team exercise. Now let's imagine fantastic futures. What do they look like? And I can pull in the levers of change and say, all right, now that you've built that fantastic version of yourselves, how would you change your system in order to create that? Let's work now through the 8 levers of change so that you can get there. And that becomes ultimately something you can implement.
We do a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies. They're a large cohort of the audience that listens and watches Impetus Digital. And so bringing up this idea of workflow, and there's a lot of discussion, and the buzzword right now is digital transformation. And we're looking at, automation, workflow automation, and changing even the way people are working with patients and their healthcare providers, and digitizing the communications. Where is this conversation coming up for you with leaders, with members of committees and task forces that you're working with on strategy, on the implementation of new work processes in light of this acceleration and this revolution of technologies that are available?
I love this question so much. I want to answer it three different ways. So I think you're talking about something, Natalie, that I discovered in my studies called complementary innovation. So it's not enough to just plop a new technology down into a system. That's not going to produce productivity. It's all the innovations around the technology that actually harness the potential. And they saw this when we were in the second industrial revolution, moving from steam to electric, and it was widely studied then. And then we saw it again around 2000 with the introduction of computers. And the businesses that weren't able to think about the entire system being different, as you said, workflows and training, where decision making takes place. Those are the companies that went out of business. So when I hear digital transformation, I perk up and say, let's think all the way around those levers about how how do we go after those complementary innovations that are really going to transform the system based on this new technology that's coming in. One other thing that I want to say is with a number of my clients, I really encourage them to form what we call signals groups. And these are groups that usually are not made up of the leaders. Often they're high potentials from across the business. And we say to the signals group, hey, we want you to study the new technology. We want you to become the nerds on behalf of the senior leadership team. And after you study it, we want you to start thinking about what are the implications of this for our work? How are we going to do things differently? What's going to happen to people's jobs and to information flow and to reward systems? And then we bring them together with the leaders and they end up teaching the leaders. This is a pretty beautiful thing because you're starting to see the idea of innovation and workforce transformation more broadly throughout the organization. One of the groups that I worked with has taken this concept one step further, and they now have communities of interest. So they bring people together to think about the future and the impact of the technology on remote sensors or something else. And sort of engaging and harnessing the creativity of a lot of people to think about what's coming, I think is really powerful.
So when we're thinking about these complementary innovations, there's so many different layers of it, and we probably would have like hours and hours of conversation just on that alone. But let's actually just dissect this for a minute. So right now, many people are still working from home and probably will be. I mean, again, the jury is out on, there's a lot of excitement about things getting back to normal sooner than later because the vaccine has now been unleashed. But let's just say, for example, there's still going to be at least a hybrid model.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of interesting concern around the ability to develop and sustain cultural memes, norms, being able to foster that. And I think for some leaders who've really been socialized into needing some semblance, even though it might actually just be more of an illusion of surveillance and of management, sort of by walking around and sort of monitoring people's productivity, as opposed to trusting and maybe using other sorts of measurement tools to determine the level of productivity. What is your sense when people speak to you about that with this new world of people working from home, leveraging computers, and that sort of thing? How do you speak to them about culture, managing people, and the need for control and surveillance?
That's a great question, Natalie. I do think, just to underscore your point, that a lot of the meetings and events and conferences that I've done in the last year, where I was just scrambling to understand how to do it in the virtual space to begin with, like everyone else, afterwards people would come and say, that was kind of amazing, much better than we anticipated. We actually think there are strengths about meeting virtually that we didn't anticipate, and we don't want to lose those strengths. So that's why it's going to be a hybrid model, not because we're too scared to come back or we're too cheap to come back. It's going to be a hybrid model because there are real benefits to the virtual that we've now experienced, and we don't want to let go of them. So that's going to be the next scramble, is how do we design hybrid experiences that are powerful? And I guess that'll be my challenge in 2021 and 2022. But I just, this is very high level, but to talk about the way of management, I think everything I've read in terms of this transformation around digital transformation is that it's going to accelerate something that's already been happening, which is that we're moving from command and control styles of management to more horizontal styles of management. And like many other things, telehealth, for example, COVID has just put that transition on rocket boosters. So if we didn't know how to manage horizontally before COVID, we're just going to have to learn now, because that's kind of what the virtual workforce has required of all of us. And I think those are different skills. I loved that you said, different outcome measures. That's one of the levers. If I used to be able to look over your shoulder and assure myself that you were doing the work I cared about, I didn't need to understand a different way of measuring your productivity, but now I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And scorecards and metrics are a huge component of conversation. So not only what are, first of all, being aware of what the traditional metrics have always been. We've always looked at P&Ls, and we've looked at how many hours somebody was actually sitting officially in the office. And so this is an opportunity to revisit that and rethink and reimagine, what does this look like, both from a quantitative but also a qualitative standpoint. And then secondly, we now live in a digital world. So are these just going to be spreadsheets? Are these just going to be these 2D analog types of representations? Or are we going to challenge ourselves with opportunities of visually stimulating dashboards and things that everybody can participate in and get really excited about? What's your sense on what this new world will look like around measurement?
So I think it's as old as the balanced scorecard, looking at things that are a little bit unusual to measure what success looks like in a company. But I also love what you said about visualizing data, and I want to recommend, we can stick it in the show notes, that people go to a company called spatial.io, with whom I have no relationship, and watch the video on their website, because they're using augmented reality to allow you to interact with the digital content. So you can be collaborating with people in different geographies, and you can be manipulating the data in 3D. It's a great video on their website. And that's definitely the kind of technology, I think, augmented reality technology, that allows you to be in the room, but also to be in the digital space at the same time. That's where the revolution is going on that one.
Are we asking too much of people too quickly? I personally consider myself a relatively geeky person when it comes to digital, and I love all things digital. And I just personally purchased a new VR headset to start down, and this is fairly late in the game, I think. But having said all of that, the idea of potentially working and collaborating in virtual reality or mixed reality and asking people to do these things, are we pushing people too hard? Are people skilled enough? Have we given people the right ammunition and tools and knowledge and confidence in order for them to do this? What's your sense on that?
The thing that just galvanized me when I started studying the industrial revolutions is that this is World Economic Forum stuff. They think we are in the fourth industrial revolution, which is really about AI. But what struck me is the previous three industrial revolutions took place over 70 or 80 years. And during that time, there were tremendous changes in society that accompanied the way technology impacted work. Um, they are predicting that this fourth industrial revolution is going to take place over 15 years, 1-5. So I do think it's too fast. I don't think we can slow it down, though. I think we've got to acknowledge how quickly this is happening around us. And I love your point about, are we giving the workforce the tools that they need? Every study I've shown, major leaders say, yes, this revolution is coming. 60% of them will agree that it is, and then 18% of them will say, and I'm preparing my workforce for this. But when you think about that compressed period of time, that 15 years, we're not going to get a magical new workforce. We're not just going to graduate these kind of digital natives and replace everyone that's already working right now. We have to take our current workforce through this industrial revolution. And it's something that I think about a lot and hope we will spend more resource on, because otherwise it's just going to be much rougher than it needs to be.
a core lever, a part of your book with the 8 organizational levers is really around people. And I think fundamentally everything always comes down to people, because they were the generator of data, information, metrics, process flows, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're thinking about this and on this topic of machine learning, on the topic of artificial intelligence, robotics, and on it goes, are we at a juxtaposition that has been almost like a confluence of craziness that was accelerated from COVID, but was just a natural progression that was happening anyway? Have we hit this hurricane where it's now been accelerated like 8 years in advance, where we have to ask the question is, where does the people fit in? We've heard a lot about the K economy, where you've had the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and people in certain jobs and in certain areas and industries are losing their positions. But are we going to see the algorithmic takeover of even the white collar position? What does this look like, and how are you preparing organizations potentially for what some people are calling the inevitable?
Kevin Kelly's The Inevitable, one of my favorite books.
I love that book.
I love that book. I
It's
get
one of my favorite
all my
authors, a
futures
great
groups
writer.
to read that book. What a great question, Natalie. In medicine in particular, there's a lot of conversation about, are physicians going to be replaced by AI? And then there's a very quick answer, which is no, they're not. But I actually think it's more complicated than that. And I think the story in that sector can help us think about other sectors as well. There's something I think of as role transformation that's going to take place. And if you don't mind, I'll just do a specific example that I've written about. There's an autonomous AI device called IDXDR. It was the first autonomous medical device ever approved by the FDA a long time ago in 2018. So I'm joking because that's not a very long time. But it's called autonomous because it can make the diagnosis inside the machine, and it does use AI and a library of images to look at it. This stuff is coming very quickly in terms of images, and this isn't ophthalmology is fundamentally image based, as are pathology and radiology. Anyway, this is you can put this in a grocery store, and someone with a high school education can take this picture and tell this person if they have diabetic retinopathy. At that point, they need to go to an ophthalmologist for treatment. It's a tremendous boon because we're only screening about 50% of the diabetics in this country. So the ophthalmologists are not going to run out of work. They're going to have more complex work. That, I think, is what happens at the top of the pyramid. There's another device, Caption AI, which allows medical assistants to take point of care ultrasounds. And so much of the work is going to be moving down that chain. In Silicon Valley, they call it the N-1 stack. So things that doctors exclusively used to do will now be done by nurses. Things that nurses exclusively used to do will be done by techs. And the implications for access and cost are pretty profound. But those kinds of role transformations are something that I think you have to let people think about and get them ready for. And from a strategy perspective, you have to understand that that's the trend and figure out how you can harvest that trend and transform your business around that trend. So I think it's two pieces. One is understanding what these shifts are going to look like so that you can incorporate them into your strategy, and then getting your workforce ready for that tomorrow.
They actually have oftentimes referred to it as the 3Ds of when robotics and algorithms and machines make sense. And that is when work is too dull, too dangerous, and too, what was the third one? Dull, dangerous, and dirty is the other one.
A book that
So
I
those are
love
the things that people would
think about automation is Daniel Susskind's A World Without Work. It's a little scary, so be forewarned, but he really, he's an Oxford economist, and he just breaks down the kinds of work that will be automated and how quickly he thinks this is going to take place. And you raised exactly the right issue, Natalie. There are going to be profound kind of impacts on society, which we've already seen as we've automated so much of manufacturing.
It is so true. It's exhilarating, but also a bit breathtaking. It kind of takes the wind out of you because it's almost like getting hit by a G-force. You're just, okay, hang on, and we're going for the ride. And so, hopefully most people have got some kind of grip that they're not going to lose it in the process. And, I think the other key piece that's really interesting is we're thinking about new systems, new development. Our governments are hitting unprecedented decision making that we've never had to before. And it's all kind of getting put into this big blender, if you will, in this whirlwind of change. But I was mentioning this before in innovation systems thinking, is that the fundamental motivator behind all of this is incentivization. So people incentives, where are the rewards, financial and otherwise, coming through in this? And when we can think about this at the organizational level, but even at the systems level, is the new legislation, the new the new ethics, the new compliance, the things that create the riverbanks and the boundaries in which we can really excel and change and modify our imagination. Is what do you have to say around the new reward systems, both at the micro organizational level and then a bigger macro level, looking at the societal level?
I'm very lucky to be working with a bunch of financial regulators, and they are, of course, dealing with that G-force of fintech and digital currency and blockchain, and trying to figure out what is the appropriate kind of stance for regulation. There's some very cool stuff going on in the government sector, actually. It would cheer you up. So, I think at the organizational level, we need to be able to think about the level of change that's necessary to get us through this period. And there's this whole trend towards B Corps and looking at stakeholder capitalism, which I think might be trending for the right reason, so that as a company, am I not just maximizing profit to my shareholders? Am I thinking about where I am as a community stakeholder, with my workforce as one of my stakeholders and with my community as one of my stakeholders? And I think that trend is going to accelerate for businesses. And then, look at the meaningful use regulations that the government passed, is it 10 years ago now, 12 years ago, that just accelerated the digitization of electronic medical records. It's been a mess, but it also created, all of the data that somebody yesterday was telling me. It's like a woolly mammoth frozen in the Arctic ice, just waiting to be thawed. All that healthcare system data, and we've been, talking about it for decades, but it's all there now. But it's kind of frozen in the Arctic ice. And I do think there will be more government level interventions around interoperability, for example, that will help us thaw that woolly mammoth that's sitting in the ice. And I'm hoping that the government will also keep an eye on kind of the development of ethical AI, because it's such a black box right now. We're not really sure we know why someone is predicting that this patient is going to get sepsis, or how good is the algorithm. That's underdeveloped right now.
It really is, and it's so many interesting questions, including, I think, an overarching question for you, Cassie, which is almost the democratization of what organizations are and what they're going to be. So can we eventually see, we've seen democratization of a lot of different things over the last 10 years, but are we at a new frontier? For example, I know you do a lot of work with the fintech, but we're talking about cryptocurrencies, and we're talking about the SEC and lots of legalization around this, and regular players jumping in. But underlying all of it is this concept called NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. Bottom line is we're building value on data points that exist on the internet. So suddenly you have people producing value or valuable work or various things or information that goes out on the internet. And there's possibilities that these can get tagged and people will eventually get paid for the work that they're producing. So I guess the fundamental question that I have here is the traditional company going to start to deteriorate, as in the boundaries of what a company looks like? And are we going to eventually look at a cohort of people and ideas just, coalescing together to create something, and all the individuals, they may be part of a company or they may be part of a new uh, organization or some other coalition, then they get paid for that work and then people move on. Are we going to be seeing a new description or a new evolution of what a company is going to look like in the future?
So there's some wonderful research by an academic who's now at Penn named Philip Tetlock, who basically says, never trust an expert. It's just one of the things I tell my signals groups. And so I don't want to pontificate from that place of, telling you the answer, because I don't think we know the answer. But I do want to point out something at a high level that I think really supports what you're saying, Natalie, which is if you look back over the history of, the transformation from steam to electric, it was about distributing power from a central core inside a manufacturing plant. There was one single central steam engine core, and everything was organized around that. And then when you introduced the electric motor, it took them about 15 years, but they finally figured out that you could have lots of little motors all over the factory, and that completely transformed the way manufacturing happened. The same kind of distribution, I think of it as power, happened with computers, because I could decentralize my workforce and give them access to information in a way that I couldn't before. And I think we're going to see that same decentralization of power in the form of information and with AI intelligence. So when I put the diagnostic moment into that machine, I've taken that intelligence all the way to the edge. They talk about the edge in the military context a lot. And your example of cryptocurrency is a great one, because blockchain was invented to, create a contract that didn't require an organization. It's a digital contract between people. Cool factoid, they're using blockchain to register deeds in a county in Wyoming. It was the only application I could find in the US. But anyway, so this theme of decentralizing the power and decentralizing the information, I think, has just been accelerated by COVID. We're now all a decentralized workforce. And if you look at the gig economy and the transition towards the gig economy, that's just another signal, what we would call a signal of what might be coming. Of course, the classic example is Encyclopedia Britannica as the source of all knowledge that was, probably sold to me as a kid, but not to you as a kid, versus Wikipedia, which is created by the crowd. It's a completely crowdsourced kind of knowledge making. And people
It's really
didn't
interesting that
predict
you're
that was
mentioning
possible.
that. Yeah, I think it's a really cool concept. And it really makes one ask the question, just like all things in life is a bit of a pendulum, right? We go from one extreme to the other, and then somewhere in the middle, there's a centrist or a balanced view, and then we hit the other level. But we're in this place of this completely decentralized place of information sharing and ability to get knowledge. Basically, the internet has made knowledge free. Basically, it's free. Knowledge is no longer this sacred thing that costs money, or so even at the university level, I mean, people are giving free courses, and so knowledge is basically free. But as we think about the organizational level, in some ways, the sharing and the ownership of certain knowledge was a bit of a control piece and a leadership piece about the us versus them. But in this new world where everything is flowing and moving around, are we finding ourselves in a place where there is not a single, as you mentioned, there is some safety in knowing that there's a single point of truth? And now we're looking at this free-flowing world, or this ocean of multiple truths. We've seen this actually, not getting political. We see this recently with the political agenda that's happened. You can have two people looking at exactly the same scenario, the exact sense of science or factoids, and see something completely different.
Right.
And so what we're looking at is we're swimming in this world of multiple facts and multiple information, because everything is free and everybody has a soapbox. Do you see us at some point wanting to go back to having a single point of truth, or somebody declaring that this is what we believe, either join us or hit the highway type of thing?
I think we're in, again, back to this notion of hybrid, I think we still need our hierarchies. Actually, I might be very unpopular for saying this, but if you look at the psychodynamics of systems that don't have any authority in them, they can get ugly really fast. They can splinter and fragment into different kinds of identity groups, and I think our hierarchies are going to be with us for quite a bit longer. And I think it's important to harness the power of that free flowing communication. I mean, all of our employees are on social media. How are we using that? All of our employees have, if you're in a healthcare system, the standard comment is every doctor and every nurse has 20 apps on their smartphone that they understand how to use, and that then they come to work and kind of, hit the systems that are 15 years old and that don't talk to each other. So it's going to be both and for at least the rest of the decade. One of the things I love saying to senior leaders is if this is in fact a 15-year revolution, then this is your revolution based on unless you're ready to retire in 2 or 3 years, you are going to take your organization through this entire revolution. That's the job. And that's pretty exciting, actually.
I love that you put it there, because some people might think it's scary, but it is exciting. So you've done a lot of work in writing on races, and this is again another hierarchical, old school term that nobody really wants to talk about, and what's R stand for, and what does A stand for, and all this sort of stuff. But where does RACI fit in trying to create and breathe some element of structure in a system that feels somewhat fluid and unpredictable and scary? How do we create that balance between structure and fluidity, where there's an ease of passage, lots of different types of channels? We know at Impetus, because everything's virtual, is there's various kind of asynchronous and synchronous tools. It's always free flowing. But how do we still have some semblance of, well, how is the information flowing, and creating some sort of a structural norm around that?
One of my clients talks about the data supply chain, which I just really love that phrase. I got interested in RACI at the beginning of my change career because often when groups were stuck or in conflict, and they were personalizing the conflict, right? They were saying, it's Natalie. Natalie's a jerk. It's Cassie. Cassie isn't, pulling her weight. We would come in and we would clarify roles. We'd use this old tool, RACI, and suddenly morale would just, go up. Everybody understood what everybody else was supposed to be doing. And I teach it now, I think, as a language more than as a project management tool, because I think you need a language to be able to talk to each other about role and work that's efficient, right? RACI is embraced by global companies because people who are working across different primary languages just are going to get really lost in the narrative if I'm telling you what I want you to be accountable for. But RACI is dead simple. So I think it's very relevant, actually, because as work becomes more horizontal and we collaborate across boundaries more, which might be different departments or it might be different organizations, depending on how crowdsourced our world becomes, it could be across different kinds of entities. We really need a language to talk about role and work. And we need to develop what I call horizontal leadership skills. And they're fundamentally different. Some of them are the same, but if I'm, successful because I've been able to be good at vertical management, I identify the talent, I develop the talent, I evaluate the talent. When they're not working out, I fire the talent. Those are all vertical skills. In the horizontal, most of the time we don't have that kind of authority. We're just kind of thrown into work teams with people from other areas. We're not invited to evaluate their performance. They certainly aren't going to get their bonus or their performance evaluation from a horizontal team member. It throws everything into a different relief, and you need persuasion and influence skills and communication skills of the yin yang, and you really need this language to be able to negotiate role. If I want you to do something, I can't just tell you in my old command and control style because you're my peer. I've got to negotiate with you. And I think RACI is a language that helps you do that.
I think beautifully said, and I love the way you use that language. Information is everywhere. In fact, that's the new dopamine trip, is everybody is, and in fact, that's actually the new gold, is gaining people's attention. Google wants it, Facebook wants it, every social media outlet wants it. Everybody wants the one limiting factor that we have, which is our attention. We are living in a world of narrative and stories and information galore. how do we protect ourselves from that and within the organization, and only make sure that the right stuff is getting to the right people and we're not over flooding ourselves?
I want to go back to the 8 levers of change, because I think if you think enough about how the system has to transform to support the change, you run into this issue pretty quickly that, like, well, if you have 13 different change initiatives going on in your organization, how are you going to make them coherent to your workforce? If you go out with 13 different narratives, 13 different system changes, and you as a leadership team haven't figured out how to integrate those, then people are going to be completely overwhelmed. And when people are overwhelmed, and when the message coming from the environment is contradictory, they just tend to sit down and be cautious. They wonder which signal from the environment they should be listening to, and they just go on doing things the same way that was safe for them before. And then what drives me crazy is that we blame the workforce and we say, oh, they're resistant to change. And I say, not necessarily. You haven't produced coherent change for the workforce, and they're going to behave cautiously in those circumstances.
I love that. And I think this is a great way to wrap up the conversation. At the end of the day, we're all still humans, and our ultimate need is to feel safe and secure. And I think this is a really key message, especially in this exciting but very tumultuous time of rapid change. We have to be very aware of the level and the speed at which things are happening. We need to actually protect people in this environment. And again, the mental health and wellness is a key piece of this. So I just want to thank everybody today for, as we reach the top of the hour here, for coming to attend and listening to this great conversation. I wanted to let everybody know that anybody who's interested in connecting with Cassie, I think fundamentally some, either for your organization, some leadership discussion, strategy, she is a great person in her company to get a hold of. Really encourage you to read her book. All of her contact information will be in our show notes when those are made available. I'd also like to encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. If you're interested in having these kinds of stakeholder conversations with your internal folks, globally or locally, determining how you're going to manage strategy, your plans, your races, your conversations, how you're going to be leading, and do this asynchronously and synchronously over time. This is actually what we do at the Impetus Insight platform. So we'd love to hear from you. Please like and subscribe so that you can hear other new innovations from us on this channel. We want to thank all of you for attending today. Thank you, Cassie, for an outstanding conversation. And I just want to wish everybody a wonderful day ahead.